For more than 2 decades, Judge Margaret Harrison had ruled her courtroom with an authority that few dared to challenge. Her colleagues called her disciplined, defense attorneys called her merciless. Whatever the label, one truth was clear. When Margaret presided, the law was absolute. She had earned the nickname the Steel Gavel early in her career, not because she shouted or threatened, but because she never wavered. Every motion, every objection, every verdict was handled with surgical precision. Emotion had no place beneath her black robe. On a crisp October morning, however, something in the air felt different. The sun filtered through the courthouse windows in long, golden lines, spilling across polished benches that had seen decades of anxious witnesses and trembling defendants. Yet today, even the seasoned officers stationed by the door seemed uneasy, as if they could sense the gravity of what was about to unfold. Margaret arrived earlier than usual. Sleep had eluded her the night before, and the file on her desk, the one she had already reviewed a dozen times, still refused to leave her thoughts. She stood by the window, watching the city below stir awake, cars crawling through intersections, a paperboy tossing the morning edition, the hum of ordinary life. It all seemed oddly distant. When her assistant knocked softly and said, "Your Honor, the courtroom is ready," Margaret took a slow breath and turned toward the mirror. The woman who stared back was composed and steady, the picture of judicial control. Yet beneath that calm surface, a faint tremor lingered. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but an unfamiliar sense of unease that she couldn't quite name. By the time she stepped into the courtroom, silence had already claimed the room. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise," and everyone stood as she took her seat behind the bench. Margaret's eyes swept the room with her usual careful assessment, but today, the familiar ritual felt heavier. Something in the air, or perhaps within her, had shifted. And though she didn't yet realize it, this ordinary Tuesday morning would mark the beginning of the most profound test of her career. A moment when the steel gavel would be forced to question what justice truly meant. At the defense table sat a man whose calm presence seemed strangely at odds with the orange prison uniform he wore. His name was David Williams, and by the end of the day, the state intended to end his life. Margaret had seen hundreds of men like him over the years, men born into poverty, hardened by impossible circumstances, and eventually swallowed by the system. Yet something about David was different. His shoulders were squared, his head held high. He looked neither defiant nor broken. There was a quiet dignity about him, an unspoken composure that drew her attention the moment she entered the room. The file before her told a story both familiar and tragic. Raised in a neighborhood where choices were often a matter of survival, David had stumbled down the path that led here, one bad decision at a time. His record was heavy with the weight of those choices, each page detailing the slow unraveling of a life that had once held promise. For months, the case had passed through her courtroom, each hearing another step toward this inevitable day. She had watched him sit silently beside his attorney, Sarah Chen, a young public defender whose fierce dedication was tempered by quiet exhaustion. Sarah had fought with everything she had, but the evidence was unyielding. The verdict, when it came, had been no surprise. Now all that remained was formality, the final confirmation of a punishment that had already been decided. Yet as Margaret studied David's expression, she couldn't shake a faint, inexplicable discomfort. He didn't carry the look of a man awaiting death. His gaze was calm, steady, even peaceful, as though he had already made peace with something far beyond the reach of the court. The bailiff's movements, the rustle of papers, the faint hum of the ceiling fan, everything seemed distant, softened. Time itself felt slower here, stretched thin across the tension in the room. And for the first time in her long career, Judge Harrison wondered if justice, in its most rigid form, might sometimes miss something essential, something deeply human. She forced the thought aside. Discipline was her armor, and sentiment had no place in the courtroom. Yet as her gaze lingered on David Williams, a quiet question stirred in the back of her mind, one she didn't yet dare to face. The proceedings unfolded with the mechanical rhythm Margaret knew by heart. The clerk read the formal charges. The jury's verdict was entered into record. Every word followed the script of countless trials before it. Margaret lifted her gavel, preparing to deliver the final sentence, the moment that would formally seal David Williams's fate. Her voice was steady, her expression controlled. Yet as she began to speak, her eyes drifted back to him. He met her gaze without flinching, and for a fleeting moment, the solemn formality of judge and defendant seemed to dissolve. When she finished, a silence fell, the kind that pressed on the chest like weight. Then Sarah Chen rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said softly, "my client wishes to address the court before sentencing." It wasn't unusual. Defendants often use their final moments to plead for mercy, proclaim innocence, or curse the system that condemned them. Margaret nodded once. "Permission granted." David stood slowly, his chains clinking faintly in the still air. He looked not at the crowd, nor at his lawyer, but directly at her. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear, calm, deliberate, each word chosen with care. "Your Honor," he began, "I know what's coming. I know that tonight I'll pay the price for what I've done." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not here to beg for mercy or claim that I'm innocent. I did what they say I did, and I've lived with that truth every day since." The statement caught Margaret off guard. There was no defiance, no bitterness, only acceptance. "But there's one thing I need to ask," he continued, his voice softening. "Not for me, Your Honor, for someone else, for someone who deserves more than I gave her." Every ear in the courtroom strained to hear. Even the court reporter's pen paused above the page. "I have a daughter," David said. "Her name is Amelia. She's 7 years old now. I haven't seen her since she was 5. He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a small, worn photograph, edges frayed, colors faded. He held it up gently, his hand trembling only slightly. "Her mother decided to keep her away from all this, and I can't blame her. But before I die, I'd like to leave something for her. A message. Something she can keep. To know that I loved her, even after everything I did wrong." The words hung in the air like a living thing. Margaret didn't move. In 23 years on the bench, she had heard countless pleas for life, for forgiveness, for one more chance. But never one like this. He wasn't asking for freedom. He wasn't trying to delay his execution. He was asking for time, a few stolen minutes, to leave a piece of himself behind for a child who would grow up in the shadow of his mistakes. For the first time that morning, Margaret felt the solid ground of procedure shift beneath her feet. And as she looked at the photograph in his trembling hands, something deep within her, something she had spent a lifetime suppressing, stirred awake. For a long moment, the courtroom remained utterly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Judge Harrison's response. Margaret sat motionless behind the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the polished wood. She had spent 23 years building her reputation on precision, discipline, and a firm separation between emotion and duty. And yet, as David Williams stood before her holding that faded photograph, something inside her refused to remain silent. Her mind moved quickly, as it always did, scanning statutes, precedents, procedural limits. There was no legal provision for a request like this. No court order could delay an execution for sentiment's sake. The system wasn't built for compassion, it was built for order. And yet, Margaret's thoughts drifted, unbidden, to her own past, to the memory of her father, a kind, patient man who had believed in fairness above all else. He had died when she was still young, leaving behind a silence that no ruling, no achievement had ever quite filled. What would it have meant, she wondered, to hear his voice one last time? To receive a message, a few simple words, reminding her that she was loved. The thought tightened her throat. She forced herself to look away from David and focus on the victim's family seated behind the prosecution table. Their faces told a story of pain that no sentence could erase, parents hollowed out by loss, siblings sitting stiffly, as if holding their grief in place by sheer force of will. They had waited years for this day. To them, this hearing wasn't about mercy, it was about closure. How could she allow one man's final wish to reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar? The weight of the decision pressed against her chest like a stone. Margaret glanced toward the clock above the courtroom doors. Each second seemed to echo louder than the last, a relentless countdown toward 8 o'clock, when the state would carry out its sentence. The ticking blended with the faint hum of the lights overhead, the whisper of shuffled papers, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She wanted to believe that justice was simple, that it lived in the clarity of the law. But looking at David now, she wasn't sure. Perhaps justice wasn't only about punishment. Perhaps it also lived in the choices made when no rulebook could provide the answer. For the first time in years, Margaret felt uncertainty crack the armor of her professionalism. If she said yes, she would risk her reputation, possibly even her career. The state would question her judgment, her colleagues would whisper, and the public would see it as weakness. If she said no, the system would remain intact, clean, unbent, unfeeling. But somewhere, a little girl would grow up without ever knowing that her father had tried, even in the end, to leave her a fragment of love. Margaret's jaw tightened. Her gavel felt heavier than it ever had before. Somewhere deep inside, a voice, quiet but steady, began to speak. Maybe the law is meant to protect humanity, not erase it. And with that thought, Judge Margaret Harrison realized she was standing on the edge of a decision that would change her forever. Before Judge Harrison could respond, a voice rose from the front row of the gallery, quiet, trembling, but firm enough to cut through the silence. "Your Honor," the woman said, standing slowly, "please may I speak?" Margaret looked up in surprise. It was Mrs. Evelyn Patterson, the mother of the young man David Williams had been convicted of killing. Her hands clutched a small handkerchief twisted tight between her fingers, as though she needed its fragile fabric to hold herself together. The prosecutor began to object, but Margaret raised a hand. "Permission granted," she said softly. Mrs. Patterson took a hesitant step forward. For years, Margaret had seen victims' families speak at sentencing, sometimes with fury, sometimes with tears, often both. But the expression on this woman's face wasn't rage. It was something deeper, quieter, and infinitely heavier. When she spoke, her voice trembled, yet every word carried a gravity that drew the entire room closer. "My son, Michael, was a good boy," she began. "He was 22. He had a laugh that could fill a room. The day he died, I thought my world ended too." She paused, pressing the handkerchief to her lips, steadying herself. "For years, I've prayed for justice, and I suppose today is supposed to be that day." A faint murmur passed through the courtroom, but Margaret didn't move. Mrs. Patterson turned toward David, her eyes red but clear. "I've hated you, Mr. Williams. Every night I told myself you didn't deserve to breathe while my son was buried in the ground. I thought if they executed you, maybe that hate would finally go away." Her breath hitched. "But it doesn't, it never does. Nothing can bring him back." David lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly in the chains that bound him. "Then I heard what you said," Mrs. Patterson continued, "about your daughter." She took another step closer, her voice softening. "And I thought my boy never got the chance to be a father. But maybe your little girl deserves to know that her father loved her, even if he did something terrible." The room was silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "I can't forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I don't want to carry this hate anymore. If recording your message helps that child grow up with something better than what this world gave us, then I think that should be allowed." Her words hung in the still air, fragile and powerful all at once. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The faces around the courtroom blurred, the jury, the attorneys, the guards. All she could see was the woman standing before her, a mother who had every right to demand vengeance, yet chose compassion instead. Mrs. Patterson turned back to the judge, her voice trembling now. "Your Honor, please, let him leave something for his daughter. Don't let her remember him only for what he did." Then she sat down, her shoulders shaking silently. For a long moment, no one spoke. The courtroom, that sacred space of order and judgment, felt transformed, filled not with authority, but with something far more human. And as Margaret looked at the grieving mother and the condemned man who had brought her such pain, she realized that this day had ceased to be about punishment. It had become something else entirely, a fragile, painful glimpse into the heart of mercy. Judge Harrison remained still for several seconds after Mrs. Patterson took her seat. The silence that followed felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that demanded reverence, not words. Every person in the courtroom seemed frozen, waiting for her to speak. Margaret's heart pounded quietly beneath her robe. She had presided over hundreds of cases, each one demanding precision, restraint, and distance. But this moment felt unlike any other. The law, in its cold clarity, offered no guidance for what stood before her now. She looked at David. He didn't meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on the floor as though he didn't dare to hope. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, sat motionless beside him, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the defense table. The prosecutor stared forward, lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Margaret inhaled deeply and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "This court," she began, her voice measured but softer than usual, "has heard a request that falls outside the scope of standard procedure. There are no statutes addressing it, no precedents to rely upon." A pause. She glanced toward Mrs. Patterson, the mother whose composure had shaken the room more than any argument ever could. "But the purpose of this court," she continued, "is not only to enforce the law, but to serve the principles of justice and humanity on which it stands." The words felt heavy, deliberate. She was aware that every syllable might one day be dissected by committees, reporters, perhaps even by higher courts. But she pressed on. "Mr. Williams," she said, her gaze steady now, "you have accepted responsibility for your actions. The sentence rendered by this court will stand. However," the word hung in the air like a lifeline. "However, this court will grant your request. You will be permitted to record a final message for your daughter under the supervision of the State Corrections Department. The content of this message will be reviewed and stored according to protocol. The recording will then be released to your daughter when deemed appropriate by her guardian." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a low murmur spread through the courtroom, disbelief, confusion, even outrage. A few people gasped. One journalist scribbled furiously into his notepad. Margaret raised the gavel and struck it once. Crack. "Order." The noise ceased instantly. She looked toward David again. For the first time, emotion flickered across his face, not relief, not joy, but something quieter, deeper. Gratitude. He nodded once, his eyes glistening. Then Margaret turned back to the courtroom. "Justice," she said evenly, "is not diminished by compassion. It is defined by it." With that, she brought down the gavel a final time. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the chamber, sharp, decisive, final. As she stood to leave, Margaret felt the weight of every eye following her. She knew the headlines would call her reckless, sentimental, perhaps even weak. But deep inside, she understood something the world might not. That sometimes, the most courageous act a judge could take was not to punish harder, but to listen. And as the bailiff escorted David Williams away, Margaret realized that this case, this single, impossible decision, would follow her long after the courtroom emptied. The courtroom emptied slowly, whispers fatting into the vast corridors of the courthouse. Margaret Harrison remained seated behind her bench for a long moment, letting the gravity of her decision settle like a heavy cloak around her shoulders. She stared at the polished surface before her, the gavel resting silently, a reminder of her authority and the new weight it now carried. Hours stretched ahead of her, the afternoon seeming to crawl in deliberate slow motion. She couldn't focus on the stack of pending cases or the routine motions awaiting her signature. Every thought returned to the small photograph David had held, the image of his daughter, innocent and unknowing, her face a reminder of what remained beyond the reach of the law. A soft knock at the door pulled her attention. Warden Thompson entered, his presence commanding yet careful, carrying the rigid air of someone used to absolute control. "Your Honor," he said, straightening his posture, "we've made the necessary arrangements for Mr. Williams' recording. A quiet room with professional equipment under full supervision. 2 officers will be present at all times." Margaret nodded, grateful for his cooperation. "Thank you, Warden. I know this isn't standard procedure." "No, it isn't," he replied, his tone even, professional. But after 22 years managing the state's most dangerous prisoners, I've learned that the most important things aren't in manuals. Sometimes they're the things no one expects, moments that matter beyond protocol. Margaret blinked at the words, a quiet surprise passing through her. She had expected resistance, perhaps even resentment, but here was someone who understood that justice wasn't always about the rigid enforcement of rules. Sometimes it was about humanity. There was one more detail, Warden Thompson added cautiously. Mrs. Patterson, the victim's mother, has requested to be present during the recording. She wishes to hear what Mr. Williams has to say to his daughter. Margaret's pulse quickened. She hadn't anticipated this, and yet, as she looked at the warden's steady expression, she realized it could be the key to shaping this final act into something meaningful. David himself had agreed, he said. He respected her right to witness his message and wanted her to be present if she chose. The depth of his humility, even facing his final hours, struck Margaret with an almost physical force. As the minutes ticked by toward the afternoon session, Margaret found herself reflecting on the broader consequences of her choice. The headlines, the critics, the prosecutors, none of it mattered in this suspended moment. What mattered was a child who might one day understand the love of her father, flawed though it had been. Margaret thought of her own father, long gone, the absence that had shaped her childhood. How precious a single final message from him would have been. And now, she had the chance, however small, to grant that gift to another child, one born of mistakes but still deserving of love. The day had begun as any other, with routine, rules, and strict procedure. But now, it had become a test far greater than any she had faced before. Margaret Harrison, the judge who never bent the law, had discovered that sometimes justice demanded something more than punishment. It demanded courage, empathy, and the willingness to trust the humanity of those standing before her. And she would need every ounce of that courage in the hours to come. By 4:00 p.m., the courtroom reconvened. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden beams through the windows, painting the benches with sharp, slanting shadows. The air was thick with anticipation, and even the familiar sounds of the courthouse, the distant echo of footsteps, the soft click of briefcases, the murmur of voices felt hushed, almost reverent. David Williams was brought in, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of the reality that awaited him in mere hours. Yet something had shifted in his demeanor since the morning. The calm she had observed earlier had deepened into something almost serene, a man who had accepted his fate and found purpose in his final act. Margaret sat behind the bench, her gaze steady, though her chest tightened with the weight of what was to come. She addressed David directly, her voice carrying authority but softened by the rare vulnerability she now allowed herself. "Mr. Williams," she said, "arrangements have been made for your recording session. You will have 30 minutes at the correctional facility, under supervision, to leave a message for your daughter." David rose slowly, the faint metallic whisper of his shackles filling the room. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, voice steady yet thick with emotion. "You've given me a gift I will carry into eternity, the chance to tell my daughter that she was my greatest joy, even though I failed her in every way that mattered." Margaret felt a subtle tremor in her own composure, but maintained her professionalism. "Is there anything else you need to say to this court before we conclude these proceedings?" she asked. David turned his gaze to the gallery, sweeping across the faces of everyone present. When his eyes settled on Mrs. Patterson, he spoke directly to her. "Mrs. Patterson, I know nothing I say can undo the pain I caused your family. Your son's life was precious, and I took something irreplaceable from this world. But I am grateful that my daughter will grow up with the knowledge of your son's goodness, even though it was cut short by my actions." Mrs. Patterson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded slightly, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that this message might, in some small way, heal the fractures that even death could not erase. Margaret felt the courtroom shift around her. The rigid lines between law and mercy, punishment and compassion, had blurred. Here, in this room, justice had transformed into something profoundly human. She brought the gavel down with deliberate force. Crack. This court orders that Mr. Williams be transported to the state correctional facility, where he will record his final message before the sentence of this court is carried out at 8 o'clock this evening. As the bailiffs escorted David from the room, he turned back once more to Margaret. Your Honor, you have shown me a kindness I didn't deserve and will never forget. Thank you for helping me be a father one last time. The words struck her with an unexpected force. In all her years of sentencing, she had never considered the children left behind, the relationships severed by crime and punishment. But now she knew, justice was not only about what happens to the guilty. It was also about what could be preserved, even in the face of irreversible loss. Margaret watched as David disappeared from view, carrying with him the fragile hope that a father's love could survive even the darkest of circumstances. And in that quiet moment, she understood something she had never truly grasped before, that true justice sometimes required more than enforcement of the law. It required empathy, courage, and the willingness to honor humanity in its most broken forms. The correctional facility was quiet, almost eerily so, as David Williams was escorted to a small, secured room prepared for the recording. The walls were plain, the lighting soft but sufficient, and a professional microphone stood ready in the center. 2 officers remained near the door, silent sentinels of the law. David's hands, though still restrained, moved with a gentle precision as he approached the microphone. The photograph of his daughter, worn and faded at the edges, rested on the table before him. He touched it lightly, a fleeting smile passing over his face, the kind that only a father could wear when thinking of his child. Margaret had insisted on attending. She sat quietly behind a glass partition, her expression composed but her heart heavy. The gravity of the moment pressed upon her, and she realized that in all her years of presiding over the court, she had never felt anything quite like this. David cleared his throat, then began to speak. His voice was steady, calm, and filled with the weight of truth. Amelia, he said softly, I wish I could be there with you. I wish I could hold you, watch you grow, guide you, and see every moment of your life. I failed in many ways, and I know I cannot change what has happened. But I want you to know this, I have always loved you. I always will. His hands trembled slightly as he held the photograph closer, his gaze lingering on her tiny face captured in the image. Even though I wasn't there, I have thought of you every day. I hope, one day, you'll understand that the choices I made were my own, not yours. I hope you grow to be strong, kind, and full of the love that I could only try to give you from afar. He paused, swallowing hard, the silence stretching between each word, making the message feel as fragile as it was powerful. I am so proud of the little girl you are, and I pray you will forgive the man I was, even if you never forgive me completely. I want you to know that my heart was always yours, and that no matter what, you are my greatest joy. Tears traced silent lines down his face. Margaret, behind the glass, felt her own throat tighten, the weight of years of judicial detachment pressing against her in a way that was almost unbearable. David spoke for nearly 30 minutes, every word carefully chosen, every sentiment heartfelt. When he finished, he placed the photograph back on the table, his expression serene, almost resigned. The officers nodded, understanding the significance of what had just occurred. Margaret rose slowly from her chair behind the glass, her own eyes wet. The courthouse, the law, the rigid framework she had so faithfully upheld, all of it seemed transformed by what she had just witnessed. In that small, quiet room, a father had left behind a piece of himself, a fragment of love that might one day reach his daughter and shape her life in ways the law could never touch. Margaret understood in that moment that justice could coexist with compassion, that punishment could live alongside mercy, and that sometimes the greatest act a judge could perform was to allow humanity to speak. The recording complete, David Williams was returned to his cell, the knowledge that his daughter would one day hear his words providing a quiet dignity to his final hours. The correctional officers escorted him with efficiency and solemnity, their presence a stark reminder that the reality awaiting him had not changed. Yet in that room, something had shifted. A sliver of humanity had pierced the rigid walls of the system. Back in her chambers, Judge Margaret Harrison sat alone, the afternoon light fading into early evening. Her hands rested on the gavel, now heavy with a meaning she had never anticipated. Every decision she had made over the past 2 decades seemed to converge in this single moment, and the weight of it pressed on her like never before. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from reporters, colleagues, and state officials flooding in. She ignored them all. No explanation, no defense could capture the nuance of what had transpired, and she knew that trying would only diminish it. This was not a legal victory or a headline. It was a quiet act of mercy, witnessed only by those who had been present and perhaps carried forward in the heart of a little girl who would one day understand. Margaret thought of Amelia, holding that worn photograph, listening to the words of a father who had faced the consequences of his actions, yet still found a way to show love. She thought of Mrs. Patterson, the mother who had chosen compassion over anger, and how that choice had allowed healing, however fragile, to begin. The courthouse was empty now, silent except for the distant hum of ventilation and the faint rustle of papers. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking down at the streets below. The city moved on, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place in one small courtroom that day. She realized that the steel resolve she had cultivated over 23 years, the discipline, the detachment, the unwavering adherence to law had not failed her. It had brought her here, to a place where judgment and compassion could coexist. And in that realization, she felt a shift inside herself, a quiet understanding that her role as a judge was not only to enforce the law, but to honor the humanity of those who stood before her, no matter how broken or flawed. As evening approached, Margaret knew that her decision would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Scholars would debate it, colleagues might criticize it, and the public would surely have opinions. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the enduring power of empathy, the possibility of redemption, and the fragile, profound impact of a father's love reaching across the finality of his own mistakes. For the first time in decades, Judge Margaret Harrison allowed herself to feel the weight of her humanity alongside her duty. And in that space, she discovered a truth that would remain with her forever. That sometimes, justice is not only about punishment. It is about understanding, connection, and the courage to allow compassion to guide the law. And somewhere, years later, Amelia would listen to her father's voice and know that, even in the face of darkness, love had prevailed.